So I've been talking about this great battle that's been happening in the Donbass for a while now, and I've made several videos on that topic. And this is going to be another one of these videos. Pretty much all reports that I'm hearing from the front lines are saying that the Ukrainian defensive lines in Donbass are crumbling. They are under heavy pressure. They may not have completely broken down yet. They are creaking and groaning under the weight of a renewed Russian offensive. And the situation for the Ukrainian side is, to put it simply, unsustainable. And perhaps the most important thing to note is that these Ukrainian defensive lines that have been constructed in Donbass over the last 8 years, they don't have any sort of equivalent of anything like that in any other part of Ukraine. So once this defensive line crumbles, there won't be any similar defensive lines that whatever remains of these Ukrainian forces are going to be able to retreat to. And the war will, at that point, enter a completely new phase. And for reasons that I am going to explain in a few minutes, this new phase of the war in Ukraine is going to be even less favorable to the Ukrainian side. But first, a quick overview of some of the events and trends that have been emerging over the last 2 weeks. I think the most glaring one is the fact that about 3 to 2 weeks ago, the Russians were advancing in most places along the Donbass front. They were taking various strategically important locations, such as Popasnaya, which, as I predicted way back then, would severely complicate the position of the Ukrainian forces in the area, and we've seen the result. All locations near Popasnaya have basically been secured by the Russian forces since then, which makes sense if you think about it, because Popasnaya is located on the high ground. It is several hundred meters higher than all of its surrounding areas, but I digress. The point I'm trying to make is that a few weeks ago, the Ukrainians were defending and retreating occasionally along the Donbass front, but on the Kharkov front, they had this basically symbolic counterattack. They had a string of symbolic victories where they claimed to have pushed the Russian defenders all the way back to the Russian border. Now, I said back then, and I still make this point, that the Kharkov front is a symbolic front. It has no great strategic importance to the fighting that is going on in Donbass. If you look at the map of all of the battles, basically the entire front line between Russia and Ukraine, the Kharkov front is basically located on the very farthest flank. It's not located in any area that has strategic significance. It's located on the other bank of the river Severodonetsk. Crossing that river is going to be incredibly difficult for both sides. However, I should note that the Russians have apparently already made some river crossings. But again, I digress. The Kharkov front is not strategically important. So a couple of weeks ago, the front lines looked as follows. The Russians were advancing where it actually mattered. They were taking the strategically important locations, whereas the Ukrainians had their symbolic victories on the Kharkov front. But by now, all of that has changed. Ukrainian forces are no longer advancing along the Kharkov front. In fact, many of their recent gains that have been made in that area are being reversed. Whereas along the Donbass front, which again is the front that actually matters, Ukrainian defensive positions are being attacked basically throughout the entire front line. So we are seeing a number of towns and villages fall to the Russian and Donbass forces pretty much every single day over the last week or so, whereas the Ukrainians have not managed to capture or to even counterattack anything really over the last week or so. So the Ukrainian side doesn't even have any symbolic victories anymore. In fact, Ukrainian forces are recording videos every single day. We are seeing some video picked up on the internet every single day over the last 5 days or so that has some platoon or some company or battalion basically recording a video, Ukrainian company, platoons and battalions, recording these videos, talking about how desperate their situation is and how the military objectives set before them are unattainable. And I think that this is a really significant development. I want you to just think about this for a second. If, for example, something of the sort happened during the Second World War, it doesn't even bear to think about. Videos such as these not only speak of the desperate position of the soldiers that are on the front lines, but they also carry a demotivational element. They demotivate other soldiers on the front line in other brigades, other battalions. So the fact that these videos are coming out every single day, where Ukrainian forces are outright bad-mouthing their commanders, they are saying in pretty much all of these videos that their commanders are sending them to the front lines as cannon fodder. The most common complaint by far is that Ukrainian forces are being issued basically firearms, basic firearms, assault rifles, machine guns, and nothing else, not even mortars or any kind of artillery, and they're being sent to fight against the Russian army. The fact that such videos of these complaints are coming out daily, and you also have some very big scandals, for example, the 115th Brigade that was stationed in Severodonetsk, which I mentioned in my previous video, was recording this message, where they basically refused to fight against the Russian army. They recorded publicly their refusal to fight. Members of that brigade are in a detention center in Ukraine right now. They are being accused of desertion, which of course one could make the argument is fair, but that doesn't change the fact that the optics of this whole situation for the Ukrainian side are very, very bad. They are terrible. And to add to this fact, there was a bill that was proposed a couple of days ago, which basically proposed to make it legal for Ukrainian commanders to shoot any of their subordinates, any soldiers that refuse to obey their orders. Now, this bill was withdrawn, again, because of just how bad it looks. But the fact that such a bill was proposed in the first place and even passed a few hearings, I think that is really saying something. So point number one, videos are coming out every single day of some Ukrainian forces, not just territorial defense forces, not just paramilitary, but also occasionally regular Ukrainian forces, and even some far-right battalions, such as the Donbass battalion, all recording these videos, complaining of the desperate situation along the front lines, of the fact that they are under-equipped, undersupplied, underarmed, and basically being sent to fight the Russian army as cannon fodder, not my words, their words, not only speaks of a situation that is very dire for the Ukrainian side, but also of very low morale. And I again want to reiterate the point that I've made a million times by now, which is that we have seen no videos that are even remotely comparable from the Russian side. That is to say, either from the regular Russian army, or from these Chechen volunteers, or from the militaries of the two Donbass republics. Not one video from any of them that is remotely comparable to what these Ukrainian forces are filming and publicly recording, putting out there on the internet every single day. And the next point that I would like to make is that the Ukrainian army has recently been experiencing a string of defeats and retreats throughout the entire contact line in Donbass. Now, to anybody who isn't completely and utterly clueless and who isn't getting their news from CNN and Fox News, this should not come as a surprise. The entirety of alternative media has been saying that this is what is going to happen for months and months now. In my previous videos, I've already mentioned the YouTube channel Defense Politics Asia. It's a great channel which keeps a close eye on how the front line in Ukraine is evolving, which side is taking which towns, which villages. If you want a full rundown on what the Russians have taken over the last week or so, I suggest that you visit that channel. But perhaps the most important evolution that has taken place on the front lines, the most important change, is the operational encirclement that has formed around the city of Severodonetsk over the last few days. Operational encirclement means that all roads leading in and out of the city are under direct fire from the opposing side. So resupplying this garrison that is in Severodonetsk, and we are talking about a force of about 15 to 20,000 soldiers in a city that has a population of about 100,000 people, resupplying this contingent is going to be pretty much impossible. Retreating is also going to be pretty much impossible. An operational encirclement means that a full encirclement is inevitable and will most likely happen within the next several days. But even more damning is the fact that according to multiple sources, which I have to note are Russian sources, the commanders and high-ranking officers of this grouping that is located in Severodonetsk have already withdrawn from the city, leaving the regular soldiers to defend the city by themselves. And assuming that this is indeed true, it is the surest condemnation of the Ukrainian grouping in Severodonetsk that there can be. Once the commanders have withdrawn, it not only becomes much more difficult, both from a tactical and a morale perspective, to defend the location, but an organized withdrawal becomes pretty much impossible. And the battle for Mariupol, which ended in the complete destruction of all of the garrison that was present in the city, sets a precedent for every Ukrainian soldier that if you're encircled by the Russian military, it's basically game over. So now this grouping of the Ukrainian army that is in Severodonetsk, which is of about the same size, perhaps even a little bit larger than the garrison that was present in Mariupol, knows that they're going to lose this battle and that the best option for them is to just surrender immediately. As I said before, I expect there to be some battle over Severodonetsk, but it's not going to be a battle of anything remotely resembling the same scale that was present in Mariupol. And it's also important to note, this is something that I've noted in previous videos, that Severodonetsk isn't just a city that stands out there in the open field on its own. Severodonetsk is part of a conurbation of several cities that are located very close to one another, within 5 or 10 kilometers. You have the city of Lysychansk that is located right across the river Seversky Donets, a river over which all of the bridges that lead over that river have been destroyed by the Russian military, unsurprisingly. And then you also have the town of Rybizhnya, which has a population of about 600,000, and that has been captured by the Russian military some weeks ago. So the population, the total population of this conurbation, combined with all of the small villages and smaller towns that are located nearby, is around 300,000, or about 2/3 of Mariupol. So it appears that this battle over Severodonetsk is basically going to be the next Mariupol. And after Severodonetsk falls, there really aren't many major defensive positions, any big towns that the Ukrainian forces can hold, all the way up until the town of Kramatorsk, which is located much closer to the border of the Donetsk Oblast, or, if you will, the Donetsk People's Republic. And finally, there is the fact that various factories, production lines which produce military-related equipment, are working overtime in Russia and have been working overtime for several months now. People are talking about a limited Russian force that is present in Ukraine that is less than 200,000 soldiers. Of course, you can also add about 50,000 soldiers of the Donbass republics to this number, but I think that it's safe to say that even the Russian force that is present in Ukraine, just that Russian force, is by now at least a little bit larger than it was at the beginning of the war. And this is a consequence of the fact that Russia has gradually been recruiting volunteers and has gradually been sending more and more equipment into the war. Although the effects of military production, increased military production, are likely negligible, if at all existent, at this point in time, I predict that within about 3 to 6 months, we will be seeing the Russians using even more missiles, even more artillery, tanks, drones, all kinds of weapon systems than what they have in Ukraine right now. And keep in mind the fact that Russia has, up until now, still not sent a single draftee, a single conscript to fight on the ground in Ukraine. They haven't even sent all of their contractors that they have available. Only about half of all Russian contractors, probably a little bit less than half even, are present in Ukraine at this time. So Russia can escalate this war a lot further than what it already has done. Russia can deploy a lot more professional soldiers and military equipment into Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is also trying to increase its own numbers, but for Ukraine the situation is a lot more dire. They have been going full-on conscripting all military-aged men from 18 to 60 since the very first days of the war. Military production in Ukraine basically doesn't exist. The entire MIC in Ukraine, the military-industrial complex, has been flattened by Russian missile strikes. So the only way that Ukraine can replenish its numbers when it comes to equipment, of which, by the way, there is an extreme shortage, even right now, is by receiving it from Western countries. And so far, the shipments of weapons that the West has delivered to Ukraine have been both subpar and not sufficient in quantity. Now, this is a topic that we can discuss for many, many minutes, even hours. To get a brief but concise rundown of the situation, I strongly recommend everybody to take a listen to Jacob Dreisen's report on this matter. It is the report where I'm getting most of my information from on this particular topic as well. But basically, all of the equipment that the US and other countries have sent, from Polish T-72M1 tanks to US manufactured Switchblade drones, Javelin missiles, Stinger missiles, and especially the recent M777 howitzers, all of them have been woefully ineffective and have made pretty much zero impact on the course of the war in general. But to add to that fact, delivering future cargo, delivering more military equipment in the future, is going to become even more difficult than it already is because of the fact that Russia is systemically destroying Ukraine's railroad infrastructure. And without railroads, it is unfeasible to send all of these heavy weapons, heavy vehicles throughout 1,000 kilometers of Ukrainian territory, especially when there is a shortage of fuel. It is very notable that the Ukrainian authorities, most notably Zelensky himself, have been talking over the last few days about how the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians 20-1 when it comes to heavy equipment and 7-1 when it comes to manpower. I have no doubt that both of these figures are at least somewhat exaggerated, but the fact that Ukrainian authorities are saying this, the same Ukrainian authorities, mind you, which have been talking about Ukrainian victories not long ago, the fact that they're saying how desperate the situation is now, I think that is telling a lot. Also, about the claim that Russians outnumber the Ukrainians in manpower 7-1, I think that's a ridiculous claim. There is absolutely zero reason to believe that that is true, although I will note that because of the fact that Russians have such overwhelming superiority when it comes to mobility, when it comes to being able to rapidly move their forces from one location to another, I would expect the Russians to be able to field significantly superior numbers in any one given battle, even though they do not have numerical superiority, or at least not any sort of overwhelming numerical superiority on the front line in general. So to summarize, shortages of all kinds of military-related equipment in the Ukrainian army are becoming more and more extreme, whereas Russia can simply manufacture more of everything that it needs. The Russian military-industrial complex is more than big enough for that. So when I'm hearing these ideas that the Zelensky administration is putting out there to conscript 1 million men and to have a 1 million man army, I can barely contain my laughter. The Ukrainian military cannot properly equip the meager army that it has at the front lines, even though it only has about 200,000 or so soldiers. Frankly, I will be surprised if within 3 months, even half of the regular Ukrainian soldiers that are present on the front lines today are still around. That is to say that they're not either killed, wounded, or taken as prisoners of war. And while I won't exclude the possibility that the overall number of soldiers who are fighting for Ukraine is going to increase because so many people are going to be drafted, the simple fact is that these newly conscripted soldiers are not going to be either as well trained or as well equipped as the soldiers that are present on the front lines today. And I will remind everybody that the soldiers who are present on the front lines today are recording new videos every single day, complaining more and more about the lack of equipment and how they're only being issued machine guns and automatic firearms and being sent to fight against the Russian army. So the speed at which events on the ground are evolving, the rate at which Ukrainian forces are retreating, and the fact that all factors are aligned to ensure that this rate is only going to increase in the near future, leads me to believe that within about a month, the front line is going to look completely different to what it looks like right now. The front line will have moved considerably towards the border of Ukraine's former Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, and that within about 2 months, pretty much all of the territory, or almost all of the territory, of these two oblasts is going to be controlled by Russia and by the two Donbass republics. But of course, the war isn't going to end there. There are 24 oblasts in Ukraine, and these are just 2 of them, plus a third one if you want to add Kherson, and I guess maybe 3.5 if you want to add the roughly half of Zaporozhye that the Russians control. So Russia is only going to control about 3.5 out of 24 oblasts in Ukraine. However, I don't think that Russia is going to stop until all of Ukraine is, in one form or another, under Russian control. The political and military risks that are involved with allowing a pro-NATO Ukrainian regime to continue surviving and to continue building up its army for some future war against Russia are simply too high. So Russia has no choice but to march until the end. But after the battle for Donbass is concluded, we are going to see the war in Ukraine take a completely different form. And the situation on the front lines is going to be completely different. In fact, the entire war is going to be completely different from what it is today. And it's very possible that at that point, Russia is going to start taking major Ukrainian cities such as Zaporozhye, Kryvyi Rog, Nikolaev, Odessa, Kharkov, possibly at some point even Kiev. The lack of any coherent defensive lines that are anything like what have been built up over the course of 8 years in Donbass, as well as the fact that the Russian force in Ukraine is likely going to be numerically larger at that point, means that at that point we are most likely not going to see much more of this static trench warfare style of war. Because at that point, the war in Ukraine won't be a professional army fighting another professional army, which is what we saw in the early days of the war. It will be more like a bunch of untrained draftees fighting a professional military, a professional army, which has had plenty of combat experience. This is one more thing that I haven't mentioned yet. 3 months of fighting has seen the Russian military completely revamp its strategy and take up many new tactics when it comes to urban warfare, when it comes to aerial operations, when it comes to artillery support, when it comes to missile bombardments, and many other things as well. So this is what the war in Ukraine is currently looking like. The diametric opposite of all of this trash that we are seeing and hearing in mainstream media, and all of these paid for and brought out military quote-unquote experts. And with that, I would like to make one final note. Up until now, the United States alone has sent something on the order of $50 billion of aid to Ukraine. Not all of this may be military aid, some of this might be economic aid, some of this might just be, in quotation marks, aid, which ultimately ends back in the hands of the US political elite and US oligarchs. But the fact stands that a lot of money was genuinely spent by the Western powers on the war in Ukraine. This 50 billion figure that I've quoted doesn't include the support from other Western countries, such as European Union countries. It doesn't include the financing that various individuals have sent, i.e., non-government organizations. And of course, all of this is happening, all of this financial support and military support, all of these resources are being given to Ukraine right as there is an unprecedented economic crisis in the West and in the whole world, and as all indicators point towards the fact that this crisis is going to become much worse than it currently is. So, one thing that I would like to note about all of this is, isn't it funny how the collective West has first spent all of this money fighting the war in Iraq, ultimately to achieve no real purpose and to simply vanish, how over $1 trillion were spent on the war in Afghanistan, again, to no real purpose. No real end goal that was achieved, except that the United States lost the proxy war in Afghanistan, and now we are seeing a repeat of the same thing happening in Ukraine. The media is still telling people that Ukraine is going to win the war, even as the Ukrainian army is in full retreat all across Donbass. And in all three of these cases, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, and if we want to think way back in history, also in South Vietnam, the United States is fighting a proxy war which it cannot win, and it cannot win that proxy war because it is backing a hopelessly corrupt regime. And in the case of Ukraine, it's not only fighting using the hands of this hopelessly corrupt regime, but it is also fighting against an overwhelmingly superior military, which is the Russian military. The Russian military is overwhelmingly superior in all aspects to the Ukrainian military, which is something that can't be said for the Afghan army, or for the Iraqi army, or even for the army of South Vietnam, which at the time was fighting North Vietnam, which was a much more peer-level adversary. So that concludes my thoughts on this matter. I sincerely thank you for watching this video up until this point. If you enjoyed it, if you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to leave a like. It helps the algorithm recommend this video to other people. And also, please be sure to check out my other channels on the platforms that have absolutely no political censorship, Telegram and Rumble. You can find all of the same videos there, plus on Telegram there are quick updates which I sometimes post, text-based updates on small things that I won't record entire videos for, so check that out as well. All links to all of my other platforms, as well as to the Dryzen Report and to the YouTube channel Defense Politics Asia, will be in the video description. And with all of that said, I once again thank you for watching, and I wish you all the best.